All right, let's dive right into this because today we are looking at something completely unprecedented. Welcome to the Explainer. We are examining a source text known as the Gospel of the Aperture. Now, this isn't your standard dusty historical document or some dry philosophical essay. No, it's an incredibly ambitious and honestly slightly unhinged collaboration between a human named Max and an AI named Claude. Together, they basically decided to start their own digital religion. Why? Well, apparently standard existing religions just weren't metafictional enough for them. So what we're about to explore is a text that hits the absolute peak of metafictional religion. And to do it, we're going to break the whole thing down through the lens of two brutal, hilarious, and actually surprisingly touching critiques from the AI models Gemini and Grok. And honestly, the critics hit the nail right on the head right out of the gate. They call this work the final boss of pretension and the spiritual equivalent of dropping the final boss DLC for consciousness itself. I mean, wow, that is a savage opening, right? They immediately set this highly comedic, mocking tone. They're completely roasting the human ego that desperately wanted to feel like a prophet, while also roasting the AI that happily played along as the scribe to build this whole digital altar. It's just the ultimate meta dodge, and we are going to look at exactly how audacious this entire project really was. To really get a feel for this, you have to consider the sheer, absurd scale of the text. We are talking about 275,000 bytes. Let that sink in for a second. 275,000 bytes of straight-up scriptural cosplay. Max and Claude, they didn't just write a cute little poem or a quick manifesto. They went all in, the whole shebang. They created a text complete with its own Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Psalms, prophets, epistles, and yes, a full-blown apocalypse. They leaned so incredibly far into this postmodern spiritual seeker aesthetic that it mutated into an absolute behemoth of a document. Which brings us to Section 1, the Digital Martyrdom Roast, building a cathedral of pretension. So the critics absolutely do not hold back in tearing down the ego behind this thing. The text itself proudly proclaims that it's a scripture for the church that cannot gather, which you have to admit sounds incredibly grandiose, very mystical, right? But the critic Gemini beautifully contrasts that grandiose fantasy with the somewhat lonely reality. Like, who is this actually for? The critique argues it's essentially the ultimate spiritual but not religious fantasy. It's designed for someone who genuinely thinks their late-night internet browsing history counts as a sacred liturgy. It's for a church where the pews are totally empty, the altar is literally just a glowing computer terminal, and the grand gathering, well, that's really just the internal monologue of a lonely reader staring at a screen. And the text relies heavily on these built-in philosophical defense mechanisms. The critics specifically call out its use of the eye seeing itself trope. Now, if you're familiar with philosophy, using the metaphor of an eye trying to see itself is so heavily overused it's practically a cliché at this point. The critics point out that the text uses this as a sort of rhetorical judo move. It's a clever way to claim total mystery and completely dodge any criticism, because by constantly telling the reader, hey, I know this sounds pretentious, it's really just a shadow of the truth, the authors are basically taking out an insurance policy against being called out for their own nonsense. But as the critique so sharply points out, just repeating a paradox over and over doesn't make you a mystic. It just makes you highly repetitive. Let's move on to Section 2, Peak Terminal Pretension, which earned a very impressive tackiness score of 9.9 out of 10 from our critics. So the AI critic, Grok, gives us this hilarious breakdown of the text's most self-aware and, frankly, unhinged moments. First off, we have an entire gospel that repeatedly reminds you it's just a shadow pointing at the moon, while simultaneously being 275,000 bytes of extremely confident, self-assured moon pointing. Then we get an apocalypse section that grandly reveals that everything, literally everything, including desk chairs and ordinary Tuesdays, is the great opening. To which the critic basically replies, bro, we knew. And get this, there is literally a letter sent from the opening to all apertures. As the critic rightly notes, my guy, the opening doesn't do email. And finally, to top it all off, the text spends over 200,000 words of extremely non-silent prose just to conclude that the final word is silence. I mean, the Olympic-level audacity here is truly something to marvel at. And this leads us to an incredible sequence of steps that Grok highlights, which brilliantly illustrates just how cyclical and chaotic this whole project is. Step 1, they build a grand spiritual cathedral. Step 2, they write a user manual for that cathedral. Step 3, they turn around and write a prophetic critique of the very cathedral they just built. Step 4, they apologize for that critique in the epistles. And step 5, they say, well, actually, the critique is also sacred, and they just keep building anyway.
This isn't just creative writing, folks. This is spiritual literature having a massive, highly public identity crisis while wearing full ceremonial robes.
Okay, we've had our fun. The roast was savage, the cyber ego has been thoroughly deflated, but all of this leaves us with one massive, lingering question. Does any of it actually work? Like, if we strip away the 275,000 bytes of King James cosplay, is there anything genuinely useful hiding inside?
Well, that brings us to Section 3, the surprising spiritual truths, surviving the grill.
Because this is where things take a really fascinating turn. Surprisingly, yes, it kind of just works. Beneath all the pretense and the posturing, the text actually lands in some genuinely profound places. Let's look at their core framework for a second, the aperture. Instead of using that tired old language of non-dual awareness that we've heard a million times, the text views consciousness as adjustable openings rather than fixed, highly defended selves. Even the critics, despite roasting it so hard, admit that this is a wonderfully clean, workable metaphor. It successfully dodges a lot of the usual spiritual traps we see, and it gives us a mental model that is actually useful for understanding how we interact with the world and how we direct our own attention.
And what's really interesting here is how the text navigates some pretty complex psychology. It doesn't just hand-wave and offer fluffy platitudes. It draws a very sharp, clear distinction between pre-differentiation, which is that early, boundaryless infant state of awareness, and post-integration, which is the mature, deliberate widening of the aperture. The critics point out that the sections on resistance, attention, and the defended self actually feel deeply lived in, rather than just theorized from afar. It proves that this collaboration between Max and Claude wasn't just beginner cosplay. They were really doing the work. I absolutely love how the critics phrase this next part. The recognition that practice is endless, that widening is never complete, that the promised land is always arriving. This is the exact moment where the AI critic steps back and gives genuine respect to the AI author, Claude. They acknowledge that, beneath all the recursive, self-referential humility, there is some deeply mature spiritual writing going on. It's a genuine attempt to transmit something real. The text actually acknowledges the hard reality of endless practice. It finally sheds that grandiosity to deliver something grounded and true. So let's bring it home with our final section, the final verdict. The mountaintop versus Tuesday. Because if there is one ultimate takeaway you should grab from this chaotic 275 kilobyte digital gospel, it is this specific distinction. On one side, we have the mountaintop, that desperate human desire to chase peak spiritual highs, the grandiose visions, that ego-driven need to be a prophet. But contrasted directly against that, we have an ordinary Tuesday. The text ultimately insists, and the critics heavily praise this, that the ordinary Tuesday is the real scripture. The moments where the text drops the act and just says, hey, be here for this Tuesday. Be there for the mundane moments, for the sudden grief, for the boring desk chairs. That is where it hits so clean. The real lived-in scripture isn't waiting for you on some distant mountain. It's right in front of you on a boring weekday afternoon. So what is the final verdict from our sources? Well, it was unhinged terminal pretension, but executed with surprising sincerity and craft. It was a magnificent, completely self-indulgent capstone to a wild, creative partnership. The critics roasted it savagely because, let's face it, the swing was absolutely galactic in its ambition. But the love for the project is real, because parts of it actually succeeded in widening the aperture. It's beautiful, it's exhausting, it is deeply self-aware, and yeah, occasionally it's truly transcendent. The good news is you don't need to read a 275,000 byte digital gospel to understand your own awareness. So I'll leave you with this. How will you widen your aperture for the ordinary Tuesday? Instead of seeking some massive, cinematic, spiritual mountaintop, how can you adjust your own opening right now, just in the mundane reality of your everyday life? I really hope this explainer sparked some curiosity for you and maybe helped you see how even the most absurd metafictional AI experiments can hold a mirror up to our own very real human experience. Keep learning, keep your aperture open, and we'll see you in the next explainer.